As the story goes, the cricket was playing music, doing what he loved during the spring and summer and fall. The ants, on the other hand, were working hard. They were laboring day in, day out, collecting food, preparing for the winter. And when winter came around, the cricket wasn't prepared. He didn't have food. And he went to the ants to get help. He went to the ants and asked if they could share some of their food. And the ants responded by saying, "You're playing music during the summer. Why don't you dance during the winter time?" And that was it for the cricket, and he died. So the moral of the story here is that it's better to work hard now, sacrifice the present for the future. And we view that as a moral act, and that's kind of ingrained in our minds. And there's some validity to it because people who can sacrifice the present tend to succeed. Delayed gratification is a very valuable skill and ability to succeed in our world. Typically, success means stable job, high income, prestige, social status, etc. But that's just society's standard for success, and that doesn't necessarily fit in with what success is for other people. So the question here is, why do we see self-sacrifice or sacrificing the moment as a moral behavior? And this is where Nietzsche comes in. Born in 1844 in Prussia, he grows up in a very religious family. His father was a pastor. He goes on to study theology, so that's the study of religion. And he's quite a genius. After he finishes his studies, he starts working as a professor at the University of Basel and becomes the youngest ever chair of philology, the study of ancient texts, at the age of 24. So he was quite the genius. However, he experiences health issues and leaves the position. And after he leaves this chair, he isn't able to find the same success. This is the period where he writes his most influential work, but it's not widely accepted or popularized within the academic community. Eventually he collapses at age 44, essentially loses all mental capacity, and dies at the age of 55 under the care of sister. So he's quite the tragic figure. Unfortunately, his philosophy is used to justify Nazism. His sister played a pretty big role in this. So he has a bit of a bad rep, but he's also a very misunderstood philosopher. He was very against Nazism. But as we discuss his philosophy, you'll see why it might have been used to promote Nazism. But it's also misunderstood because people think it's very nihilistic, and in a sense it is. Nihilism as in there's no purpose in life. But his philosophy actually works to figure out a way to embrace nihilism and overcome that and find purpose and meaning in life. So it's quite an empowering philosophy, and I think some of you will find it valuable. So let's jump into some of his ideas. So one of his main ideas is that he questions the moral standards that we have today. We might think that moral standards, what we deem as good, what we deem as bad, has been consistent throughout history. But Nietzsche, being a philologist, which is the study of ancient text, and he was studying theology, the study of religion, recognizes that there's been a significant shift in moral standards with the advent and spread of religion, specifically Judaism and Christianity. We definitely put a lot of emphasis and value on hard work and also delaying gratification. We view that indulging ourselves in various forms of pleasure is not morally correct or praiseworthy. Why is that? Nietzsche suggests that this is due to religion. He recognizes that there's a stark contrast between ancient Roman values and Jewish Christian values. So ancient Romans are pretty famous for living extravagant lives. They also tended to really indulge in pleasures. They'd eat when they want to, they'd sleep when they want, they'd have intercourse whenever they want. And the gods that they worshipped shared similar values. Right? They'd do whatever they pleased in that moment because they had the power and ability to do so. And that was deemed as a good thing. So they essentially had the ability, especially the ancient Roman aristocrats, the upper class, and those in power. In contrast, Jewish people and Christian people were subjugated by the Romans and were experiencing persecution and marginalization from society because Jewish and Christian values and even the God that they worship has a pretty significant contrast with ancient Roman gods, and that it's also monotheistic, which means that they worship one God, while Romans are worshiping, there's many gods. And the values that it holds is in contrast, like we mentioned. It's better to living frugally, not being too extravagant, working hard, or delay gratification, or even just strongly against worldly pleasures. So you can see there's a bit of contrast, right? And Nietzsche focuses on this contrast between the Romans who are powerful and the Jewish and Christians who are being subjugated. He, as a philologist, identified that before the popularization and spread of Judaism and Christianity, the moral standards really aligned more with the ancient Romans. And after the religion took over, our society aligned its moral standards to these religions. And this is the world that we live in today. So, back then, when the Romans ruled continental Europe, Christians and Jewish people were being subjugated by the Romans. But, of course, the Romans were a very powerful entity, so they couldn't enact any sort of vengeance in the physical world. Because of this inability to enact vengeance in the physical world, Jewish and Christians actually come up with another way to enact their vengeance in more of the ideological and spiritual realm by establishing a new set of moral standards, labeling the Roman values as being evil, right? Living extravagantly, indulging in worldly pleasures, being powerful, labeling these as evil, and labeling the current circumstances as being good, which included, as they're being subjugated, living frugally, persevering through the suffering in the physical world so that you can be rewarded in the afterlife. And they eventually succeed in enacting their vengeance through the spread of their moral values. So Nietzsche labels these two ideas as master morality, which is about being strong, being action-oriented, focusing on self-actualization, achieving your goals in the physical world, whereas slave morality, which is linked to Jewish and Christian values, as valuing weakness, being poor, living frugally, humility, but being strong in spirit and belief, emphasizing prayer, and having the idea of heaven or an afterlife to look forward to. Slave morality is definitely something that I have noticed in my life. The idea of sacrificing the present and living for something in the future, right? Even though I would say I'm agnostic / atheist, I still believe in this thing, similar to heaven. So think about it. There's no way to know if heaven exists in the afterlife, right? So if we're doing something, living in the physical world today, living our day-to-day in hopes that we go to heaven, we're working and trying to go somewhere that we don't know for certain exists. I would argue that atheists and agnostic people who don't necessarily believe in a particular heaven also do something similar, in that we believe in this distant timeline called the future. We don't know if it'll exist, but we imagine it to be something, right? Whether that be practicing as a doctor, having a family, living in your dream house, etc. Those are all ideas that we create in our mind, but there's no guarantee that exists. So this slave morality of sacrificing the present for something in the future is a practice that many of us do. Nietzsche is clearly in favor of master morality for several reasons. One, he says, why sacrifice the present for something we don't even know exists? He also says this, that master morality gives us more courage to live in the present moment. Master morality also gives people the courage to live more authentically and true to their selves and their own desires, and cultivate their own value system. And that kind of goes on to the next point about how people tend to resonate with master morality more. On the inside, we might want things that align with master morality, satisfying certain desires, being able to actualize your vision and dreams, becoming rich and wealthy, right? Having power, right? Those things. Inside, we might desire those things, but when you're talking to other people, you might align yourself more closely with values of slave morality, like being modest, having humility, and sacrificing the present for the future, right? So it's about authenticity and about taking ownership of your life. Slave morality, however, cannot exist without the presence of master morality, because slave morality arose as a result of labeling master morality as being evil. So by creating that value system, it justifies the suffering that people are going through. So he argues that slave morality is built on this negative emotion, on resentment. So resentment is negative emotions or hostility that you might feel towards an object or person that is causing your frustration, or jealousy. So a lot of this is built on this negative emotion, resentment, right? And because of this negative emotion, it's inherently based on something that wants to keep people on the same level as you. Resentment, I feel, is a human emotion that arises when someone else has something that you might not have, or something that you are unable to achieve, right? When you see people doing that, you feel resentment. You feel this negative emotion because you're frustrated at your inability to get to that point, right? So you don't want anyone from your herd becoming successful. Slave morality is built on resentment. Tries to keep people in line with the crowd. So slave morality would value things like equality, to get rid of that inherent differences in abilities between humans. A lot of us live in a democratic country. This is an important value to us, right? But Nietzsche doesn't like this, because this comes back to the idea of resentment towards the differences in the abilities that we have. And he argues that we do have differences in abilities. Humans are not born equal. Some people are born with more talent. They're born into a better environment. There is inherent inequality in abilities and potential. And by claiming people are equal, it attempts to bring people who have that potential to have a big impact down to the level of the crowd or the herd. So the idea of obedience and conforming to group values, group standards, etc., rather than individualism, self-actualization, and carving out your own path. And I think an interesting example that was mentioned was the idea of how pity that we have towards other people is also associated with this idea of resentment and an idea of equality and slave morality. So this also ties in with pity. So think about a time when your friend got a bad grade, right? Your friend or your coworker is struggling with work, things aren't going too well. Slave morality would be, again, really focused on conformity, equality, right? You also don't want the other people to succeed or transcend the group mentality by self-actualizing and pursuing their dreams and being empowered. So someone with a slave morality would pity them. They'd be like, oh, I'm so sorry that happened. That sucks. I feel really bad for you, right? On the other hand, master morality is more focused on empowerment and encouragement and self-actualization. So in that situation, rather than show pity to them, encourage them, right? Show them what is the issue, try to help them resolve the situation, take actionable steps to climb out of that situation. So there's a great contrast between master morality and slave morality. Slave morality when it comes to helping others, right? And he actually even goes as far as to say that the pity and kindness that we show to others, a lot of that can be attributed to the lack of resentment that we feel towards them, in that we can only be kind to them and show pity to them when we don't feel resentment. So, for example, if you see a very successful and wealthy person going through some challenges compared to a homeless person facing challenges, which person would you be more willing to help? Especially in a competitive environment, I feel like there's a lot of resentment, a lot of competition, and you might feel resentment towards them when your own success becomes threatened by their success. And that's just the nature of the world that we live in. It's competitive, but Nietzsche wants us to break out of this cycle, cultivating your own meaning in life, self-actualizing, being honest with the desires that you have, being honest with your desire to experience worldly pleasures. That's not something that should be shamed or labeled as being evil, is what Nietzsche is arguing. I'm sure many of you guys have heard of this before. It's probably one of the most famous quotes in philosophy, right? This is a quote by Nietzsche. And he does say this with a degree of worry and regret. Religious influence was starting to wane. Science was starting to take over to explain the world. But religion up till this point was the main framework or ideology that gave people's lives inherent meaning, right? God has assigned meaning to you, right? God has a purpose for you. As society was starting to become more secular, the idea that humans had inherent meaning was starting to disappear, right? So there was this meaning crisis. What does my life mean? Why was I here? If God didn't put me on this planet, does that mean that my life doesn't have any inherent value? It does seem so, right? There's no explanation. But on the other hand, he's also happy because religion no longer gives people's lives meaning and a predetermined purpose. People now have to overcome that sense of purposelessness, take ownership and agency of their lives, and become authentic and cultivate value system and their own sense of meaning in life. So this is where Übermensch or Overman comes into play. The Overman or the Superman is a transcendent person that has overcome this sense of meaninglessness by adopting master morality. People now have the opportunity to become Übermensch, overcome that sense of meaninglessness, freed from slave morality, and to develop their own path in life that is authentic to themselves. He also comes up with this idea called eternal return. So this is a thought experiment. Instead of having an afterlife like that described by religious texts, your life will repeat eternally after you die. And he makes us question, based on this idea, if life was to repeat infinitely for the rest of eternity after you die, rather than you being done with this life once and then you get to go to heaven, if it were to repeat infinitely, would you live your life differently if you had to endure your life for the rest of eternity? Is there something you would do differently? And I think this falls into place because, again, Nietzsche's thinking, even atheist people like me, right? I spend a lot of time studying, working towards my future. But what if I had to repeat everything over and over and over and over again? Would I try to find more meaning or purpose in my day-to-day struggles, right? It encourages us to maybe change our behavior or change our perspective about the efforts that we're putting in. Maybe we are sacrificing too much in the present for some distant future that we're uncertain about. Maybe we need to live more mindfully in the present, right? Maybe we need to align ourselves more to our authentic values, right? What are the things that you can do to change your life so that you can love your life to the fullest extent? Can you love your fate and the life that you create for yourself to the fullest extent, because it's going to repeat eternally? If this is the case, wouldn't you feel more empowered to take ownership of your life, try to find more meaning and purpose in life? Wouldn't you try to live more authentically to yourself rather than claiming that you believe in certain things, putting up a facade, resenting others,